Shybro, Father James with Father Hank.
Hey.
I've mentioned this also before, that our Shybro group does, we have fraternal sharing. So once every couple weeks, the four of us, Father Hank, myself, Father Tim, and Father Derek, just kind of how things are going in life and ministry and personal life. But then we also read a book every 6 weeks or so.
Mm-hmm. It's a book club. It's not like Oprah's book club.
Yeah. So Father Hank, by the way, he's the newbie. He just joined this after ordination. So Father Tim, Father Derek, myself have been at this for a couple of years now. But anyways, the last book we read was a book called Morte de Urban. And it's the title of this podcast, in case that doesn't, it's Latin. Morte de Urban. Right?
That was French.
Oh, is it?
It's French.
Is it? No, I thought it was...
You don't really get that D apostrophe in Latin.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right, never mind. I stand corrected.
I mean, it's very similar because of French.
Cut the podcast. Start over again. No, I'm kidding.
Just a happy relax.
Yeah. So Morte de Urban, it's a novel in 1963. I should have that pulled up. I'm pulling it up right now. By J.F. Powers. Okay. So it's an old novel. J.F. Powers, I had never heard of him. In fact, another book club that I'm part of, sorry to reveal that to you, an older priest introduced me to this author. J.F. Powers lived from 1917 to 1999. He was actually from the Midwest, and he writes a lot. He's got a book of short stories. Morte de Urban, Wheat That Springeth Green is another novel. They're Catholic novels, and they're based on priests, Midwest priests. In fact, I think I'm going to have the St. Juliana Book Club read Morte de Urban. So if you plan to read this, this might be a little bit of a spoiler alert. So you can save this podcast and read it later. But Morte de Urban is centered around a religious order priest based out of Chicago. It's a fictional religious order. They're called the Clementines. But a picture like the Passionists or the Resurrectionists, whatever. And it was written in 1961, I believe, and it won the National Book Award in 1962. Published in 62, won the 1963 National Book Award. It's a really entertaining, at least I thought, novel, and there's some good spiritual lessons in it. What did you think of it?
I thought it was really cool. It's a little time travel back into the Catholic world of the 1950s or 60s. Something that I definitely did not experience, but I've heard so much about. And just to get a sense of Chicago back in the day, and to follow this little religious guy on his journey. It's not overly spiritual, but if you know how to walk through it and kind of pick up things on religious life and obedience to different assignments, a real spiritual story unfolds.
Yeah, and conversion, and that's why it's good to read as part of a book club, because you might not, the conversation can pull some things out. And his short stories, Powers' short stories, deal a lot with priests, and it's funny to see the interaction with pastors and associates. Back in the day, the pastor really was the lord of the manor, and Father Roger, the 88-year-old priest here, he'll talk about it sometimes. Associates weren't allowed to have cars, and the pastor kind of ordered them around. I never did that.
You couldn't drink alcohol for the first 5 years?
Yeah, it was just some really interesting. Associates weren't allowed to go out and be with families because it was too much like being part of the world and possible corruption. And
it's very monastic in its strict restrictions.
The maid or the housekeeper of the rectory really ran everything. She was kind of the boss. So anyways, in the story, Urban is the religious order priest. He's the main character. And he's obviously taken a vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But he's really charismatic. He preaches missions, and he's really successful. And he gets this wealthy kind of like stockbroker trader guy who lives in downtown Chicago, works in downtown Chicago, and it's implied he lives on the North Shore. And he hears Urban preach a homily, and he's really struck by Urban, and basically says, "Look, Father, anything you want, I'll give you." And he's very generous. He donates to the religious order land. So Urban's working the connections with this guy. He's really forward thinking. He's got these great ideas. And the superior of the religious order basically exiles Urban up to Minnesota. Sends him out of Chicago to this...
Oh, no.
Minnesota. This house that was donated to the order, and there's 3 or 4 other priests up there, right? And they're kind of...
simple folk.
Yeah. So Urban's he feels like he's not using his gifts and talents, but he undergoes this conversion as the story unfolds. Urban was very much of the world. He's a great golfer. Mm-hmm. He flies around the country doing these missions. He kind of wines and dines with the wealthy folk, and these fancy restaurants, and he brings great wealth to the order. But at the same time, it's not necessarily good for him, his soul, and really for the order. And as he's up in Minnesota, it seems like a punishment, but actually becomes his salvation. And the great scene is he has this golfing match basically with the local bishop. And I won't spoil it, but something happens while in the round that changes Urban.
The Lord wouldn't ruin the best game of my life.
Great line. Caddyshack. So anyways, dealing with the world and conversion. What were some of the other lessons we took away from that book, Father Hank?
I would say there's an exploration of, in religious life, you take about poverty, and in Urban's case, okay, he's living a simple life, but he's being wined and dined a lot, and a lot of the world is still kind of seeping in. So how do you have that balance even within your soul of, look, I'm living a simple life, I'm not going after anything big, but there's still just worldly things that come in. Either it's a way of thinking or the way of managing or understanding what success is all about in the world. And that's where the vow of poverty really challenges us, not only in the material, but spiritually. And I think the big lesson there, it's not so much success, but in the end game for all of us, whatever the vocation is, my intimacy with God, and is my soul close with Jesus?
Yeah, and the material things can pull us away from that, like they were doing with Urban. And obedience too. So you mentioned you talked in in our marriage podcast about the evangelical councils. Mm-hmm. Obedience. So Urban has to go up to Minnesota, and he thinks his superior is an idiot. And the superior might have done it for wrong reasons. He might have done it to punish him, actually, or he felt threatened by Urban. Maybe he did it because he knew Urban needed this purification. But God works through our superiors when we're obedient. That's the beauty of obedience. So you people listening to this, don't take a vow or a promise of obedience to your superior like we do. We do to the cardinal and his successors. You might not always think that it's the wisest thing, or obedience can be exercised in your life. You mentioned it with marriage.
Faithfulness to an employer, of honesty in your work, good work ethic.
The exigencies of the moral code or the spiritual life, you're obeying that. And there's times you might not want to pray. There's times you might not want to go to Mass, might not want to say the rosary. You might think it's dumb. But God can work grace through that action of obedience. A little death to self, a little Calvary for you when you're obedient. Same with associates to their pastors, right?
Not my pastor.
Pastors to their bishop, and so forth. So look for opportunities to be obedient, and you might experience a conversion like Urban did. God bless.
Peace.